Hello, welcome to the Pelagic Sailing Club September 2023 meeting. We have the pleasure tonight of having the author of Maiden Voyage give a talk about her experiences as she, as a young woman, circumnavigated the world. So I'm going to step aside because Tanya's a lot better at talking about herself than I am talking about her. And well, she's a lot more interesting than I am. So with that, Tanya, feel free to start your presentation.
All right. Thank you. You're very interesting. So thank you for having me, and thanks for letting me do this with Zoom. This is really great to just not have to leave my house and keep plugging away with all the things that have to happen here, and then come down and have an hour with the trip. This long ago story that I can't, it's been, it's been 35 years now since I left in New York and started the story that's paralleled my life ever since. And I've had this slideshow that I've showed and told the story with, I don't even know how many times, to so many different groups, and it's kept it alive. It's definitely a story that's been part of my life, though my life has gone on in many different directions. I guess I'll just tell it to you with the slides. I'll just jump right in. And I don't have any problems with anyone if they have a question. If there's anything that you want to know that I kind of gloss over or whatever, just holler. That's fine. Happy to answer anything. Let's see. Share screen. There we go. How is that? Oh, wait, you didn't see it yet. Okay. All right, we're good now?
Yep.
All right. So the trip began effectively in 1983, 1984, when I was the relationship with my father had deteriorated when I was a teenager. After a 3-year-long divorce and custody battle between my parents, I moved in with my dad, with my two sisters and a brother, and we were in New York, and it was the first time that we had kind of a normal life, as normal as a life we could have with a person like my father. And I got into the world of punk in the 80s, the early 80s, and that's where my friends were, and that's just where I wanted to be, and that made the relationship with my father go south. And when I was 16, he says he kicked me out. I say I walked out, and I moved in with his girlfriend at the time, who let me be me, let me be teenage me, and let me grow out of what I was doing. And also I let me go to an alternative high school that I graduated from at the exact same time that my father started going through his midlife crisis, and was deciding at that point, without really any previous experience, that he wanted to buy a boat and sail it across the Atlantic. And one thing led to another, and I went with them. I went with him, with my sister, my brother, and him. We went to England. He took a course in sailing in Florida and a mail order navigation course. And we went to England and got on Arrival 38 and sailed from England to Spain to Portugal to Morocco to the Canary Islands, across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, and then back up through via Bermuda to New York. And I spent the next almost a year on the boat with him, coming back sometimes, but making this whole trip with him, with some of my sisters and brother and friends of the family, because I graduated and I was free. Everybody else had to go back to school or work. And I fell in love with that whole world, that whole lifestyle, that whole subculture of people on boats and cruisers and the people we were meeting. And my father watched that happen. And it was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that he came up with the idea that launched the story. And it was the evening, a flat calm, and he was sipping his cognac, which always made him mushy and sentimental. And he said that I had turned into a bearable human being, but what did I want to do with my future? And I had no plans. At that point, I thought, oh, I could just hitchhike on sailboats and, keep on going. I really like this life. And he said, well, how about if I buy you a boat and you sail around the world and write about it? And at first I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe that a couple years ago we weren't even talking and now he's offering to buy me a boat and I'll take all my friends. Oh my God, we're gonna have so much fun. And he's like, no, you'd have to do it by yourself. And again, you'd have to write. So all through over the years of our faltering relationship, I'd written him many letters trying to convince him why I should be ungrounded. So he thought I was a good writer. Thought that I'd have a good material to write about out there too. And I didn't say yes right away. We did the Caribbean. We went through one of the biggest storms I've ever been through between Bermuda and New York. And when I got back to the city, my friends were talking about their plans for the future, and either they were going off to school or they were going into whatever. There were musicians, artists, students, people had plans, and I didn't really have anything. And I went to visit my mother, and she was living in Switzerland at the time, and she had cancer, and it had at that point already metastasized, and she knew she wasn't long for the world. And this is the first time in years that she agreed with my father about anything. She said that I should go, that I should get out on the ocean and live life away from, civilization. And so the point of no return really came. I started going through the sailing magazines looking for used boats, and we went down to the Annapolis Boat Show, which is where we actually found the boat, which was a Contessa 26. And right after that boat show, we went up to Toronto to see how the factory was. Is everything okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The screen, because I'll New York still.
Yeah, I'll keep going after I'm just telling the story. Can you see me? Okay. So yeah, I just tell the story with the picture of New York instead of the office behind me. And so we went up to Toronto, and it was there that we authorized the start of construction of the boat, or my dad did, and that was the point of no return. And that was in October of 1984, and I just turned 18, and people asked me so many times in the years since, what did I do to prepare? And in the next 6 months or so, I was a bicycle messenger. That's what I did to prepare. I went out and I was a bicycle messenger to save up as much as I could to have a kitty when I left. And I read sailing books, and I also took a course in coastal navigation and celestial navigation at night after the long days of biking around the city. And the coastal navigation I did well with, because I'd done a lot of that with my father on the boat. This is all in the days before GPS, and we did have a sat nav on the boat, but that broke just outside of the Canary Islands. So I also learned how to do noon sights with him. So the celestial navigation piece was familiar as far as using the sextant and getting the noon sight goes. I had a hard time in the classroom at night because it was the teacher dwelled more on the trigonometric principles, and I didn't get that. So I figured I would take the same mail order course that my father had used to figure it out with me. And being out at sea, I'd figure it out when I needed to. And there wasn't much to do until the day we went up to Toronto to get the boat and to actually be living on the boat and experiencing life afloat for the first time on my own boat. And that's when the learning started. So yeah, so that picture was of New York. That's where I left from and came back from. This was on my dad's boat. This was the Rival 38. So one of the first things I learned when I got to the boat in Toronto and we were preparing to bring her down to New York was what a huge difference 12 feet in length will make on a sailboat. The 38-foot boat was so big compared to my 26-footer. She was a real little puddle jumper, but she was also really well built, and she was small enough that I was always able to handle anything. I could always pull in the anchor. I could always pull down a sail, pull up a sail. She was the right size for me, though not very comfortable and very wet. She was never too hard to handle. Oh yeah, these were the pictures. I haven't shown the show in a while, but this was with my mother in Switzerland. We'd go, and when I went there, I'd talk and knit and watch TV, and we'd set up the camera to take pictures of the dinners we'd make together. Right before I left, she actually came back to New York, and that's where she was for the last 6 months of her life, close to my brother and sisters. We launched the boat in Toronto on Lake Ontario, and a guy from the factory said that when I cracked a champagne bottle on the bow, that I needed to save the cork for good luck. And I gave it to my dad, and he threw it in the lake. And not long after that, the engine didn't start, and we were messing around with it until the mechanic came down from the factory, and it turned out we just forgotten to turn on the batteries. But that was the easiest solution to my problems, because by the time I got to New York, I had learned how to bleed the fuel line in a diesel engine. And over the course of 2.5 years, that engine gave me so many problems that also presented learning opportunities with each one, that I got pretty good with troubleshooting diesel engines. I learned what I needed to do about maintenance and how to fix things once they broke. And also learned how to sail pretty well, because I had to sail into so many harbors without the engine. So this is the inside of Varuna. Up forward there where I'm sitting, that's supposedly that slept 2 people. I eventually got rid of those cushions, and that was just storage for sails, books, food, clothing. And just after that, on the starboard side, was a head behind this bifold door, and then a hanging locker. And then just after that was the galley, which was a 2-burner kerosene stove, a little sink, and an ice box. And then after that was the berth, that my settee. That standing headroom, it was only possible if I was standing right in the middle of the boat and the hatch was open and my head could stick up through it. This table here, I eventually got rid of that. You can see from this one here. I got rid of that table and put a plank between the 2 berths in Tahiti. When I got to Tahiti, I had time there to do some modifications that I figured were necessary from those first 4,000 miles, or no, however many miles that was to get to Tahiti. That was 1,000, 2,000, 5, like 6, 7,000 miles. Anyway, so I would step down from the companionway, got right down onto my bed, and I spent so much time just lying right there on that bed, counting the miles, reading the books, eating the food, hanging out with the cats. But that was all stuff that I was going to figure out as I went. When I left New York, I didn't know what to expect. And the other thing, this is the day I left New York, and my dad, while I was getting ready and piling the boat up with all the supplies I thought I'd need, he was out telling everybody and their grandmother what I was going to do. So there was a lot of press on the morning I left. I was on TV for the first time, answering questions about this whole endeavor for the first time, and I'd never really thought about the answers. And the big one was, why are you doing this? And my answer was consistently, why not? I really didn't have any reason to not do it or to not try. There was some fledgling inkling at the back of my 18-year-old brain that if I didn't give this a shot, this is the kind of thing that I might regret not having done for the rest of my life. I had to try. And it wasn't about leaving. This is all, like, obviously with age and hindsight that I can analyze my younger self, but I do remember leaving. When I left New York, my first landfall was Bermuda, which is across the Gulf Stream, which is where I had the worst storm ever with my father on his boat. And it's, storied as the place where so many people have started their cruising dreams from the East Coast. They've headed out to Bermuda, had a storm, decided they didn't like it, got seasick, whatever, decided they didn't like it, and that's as far as they ever get. So that was like the perfect shakedown cruise then for me to figure out if I wanted to keep on going, what it felt like to be alone out in the middle of the ocean. There was no way to know what it was going to be like for me to know what it was going to be like to be alone on the ocean until I was out there. So when I left New York, it was really about getting to Bermuda, those 700 miles. And then after that was the 900 miles down to the Virgin Islands, to St. Thomas, and then 1,000 miles across the Caribbean to the Panama Canal, through the canal, and then down across the equator to the Galapagos Islands. And then this was the longest projected passage of the trip that I was looking at when I was poring over the charts before leaving, which was 3,000 miles between the Galapagos and the Marquesas in French Polynesia, and then on down from the Marquesas to Tahiti. So I left New York thinking that my goal was to get to Bermuda. And henceforward, it was always that. It was always about getting just to the next landfall. It wasn't about getting all the way around the world for me. It was about just getting from one landfall to the other, one step at a time. So when I was in Bermuda, it was just about getting down to St. Thomas and so on. The whole circumnavigation, that was just way too big concept to wrap my head around. I breaking it down into legs was much more easier to think about it. It was easier to think about it that way. So leaving New York, this picture was taken right before the engine broke, right in New York Harbor, and I had to pull up the sails for the first time by myself, and I got out to Sandy Hook, which is at the entrance of New York Harbor, and I anchored there for a couple days and figured out I bled the engine again and got it going and waited for a nice day because it was a pretty rainy on May 25th. It was rainy, so I went and spent a couple days waiting for a nice day to leave. And when that happened, I set off for Bermuda, and it took me 12 days to get there. And I had 3 gales, a couple flat calms. The first gale, I was out in the cockpit and seasick. And at one point, I just went down below to check on things, and the boat had filled up with water. It was like sloshing above the floorboards. And in the process of figuring out where that water was coming from and pumping it out and setting things right again, I stopped being seasick, and I actually never got seasick again, which was a huge game changer. Being seasick out there would have been probably impossible to continue with the trip if I'd been prone to that. The water had been coming in through the house pipe where the anchor came down right into the bilge. It was like a pipe leading from the bow straight into the center of the boat. And I just filled it up with plastic baggies and tape, and that was fine. That was lesson number 1 of many. Out there, I also was figuring out how to work the boat. The self-steering gear was a monitor self-steering, and you guys all probably know how those things work, but that made it possible for me to never ever steer the boat until I got into an anchorage or harbor. And then if and when the engine ever worked, I did have a little auto helm, but the engine worked so rarely that thing died from lack of use. So it was really a sailboat. So the big thing out there was also trying to figure out my celestial navigation, and I got out all the books, and I had the chronometer and the sextant, and I made myself dizzy day in and day out trying to figure it out. And the only reason why I found Bermuda is because I had an RDF beacon, which a RDF finder instrument, the radio direction finder instrument that picked up the signal emitting from Bermuda about 150 miles out. So I basically kind of headed into that southeast direction until I got within range of it, and then I was able to follow that in. Something wasn't working. My celestial navigation was not doing what it was supposed to do. So when I got to Bermuda, I just figured, I was like, you know what, I'm going to figure this out. It's math. All the books say that celestial navigation is easy. It's a matter of addition and subtraction. I'll figure it out. But I sat down and wrote my first article for Cruising World, who had agreed to publish anything I wrote underway. And I wrote about the leaks, and I wrote about my navigation problem and the engine breaking and not fixing it, and the fact that it took me 12 days to get there. So when I got in, I called my dad, and he was beyond relieved. He'd been sitting at home fielding calls from people that were calling him a murderer. I was so overdue. He was beside himself. So he was super relieved, and he flew to Bermuda to help me to get the engine fixed and just get things back in shape before leaving for St. Thomas. So I wrote about this and the mistakes I made, and you know, I wasn't the poster child of seamanship at this point. So this is all before email and internet and whatever, news traveling around the world in a nanosecond. So I wrote that article. It had to wait for it to, the magazine didn't publish it for the next couple months. And so it was many, many months later that I got the reactions to that article, which were letters from readers that had to go to Cruising World and then get forwarded to me to a post office in, I think it was Tahiti, when I got my first letters, and the reactions that people had to what I was doing. And most were supportive and thought it was really cool. But there were some that said that I was a waste of taxpayers' money if the Coast Guard had to come out and get me, and that I was a menace to the seas, and Cruising World was irresponsible trying to make a star out of a 20-watt light bulb, and things like that here we are 30 plus years later, I still remember them, and I still tell that story because those were actually the letters that inspired me to keep going later when things got me down. I was like, if I don't make it, they're right. I have to keep going. But you know, I've thought so many times, if it had been nowadays with the way people can just air their opinions from their armchairs so easily, I don't know if I would have had the strength necessary to keep going, because, you know, how many people would have trolled this one? It would have been crazy. But not having that feedback was that was a huge part of what kept going. The world has changed. So I left Bermuda after writing the article and fixing things, and I got to St. Thomas. And the only reason why I found St. Thomas was because the night before I thought I was going to make landfall on St. Thomas, I saw a boat, radioed them from my position, and found out that I was actually headed for Puerto Rico. And I was able to alter course well enough to get to St. Thomas. And that's where my cat Dingy joined me. And then again, onwards to the Galapagos, to Panama, and then to the Galapagos. I crossed the Caribbean, and there's so much shipping heading in the direction of Panama. I had to just line up and follow them in. I really was having a hard time with the navigation. And I also know that it was my pride that got in the way of asking for help when I got to land. Here I was, ostensibly the single-handed circumnavigator, came in, people were impressed. There was just no way I could walk up to some other sailor and say, I couldn't navigate, and ask for help. So I was just determined to figure it out. And I did. I was out there practicing nonstop, and it just wasn't working. So this picture was taken on the way to the Galapagos. I set up the camera and took a picture with me and Dingy, the cat. And that night, because I thought I was crossing the equator, this was my crossing the equator celebration. And that night I saw a fishing boat, radioed them for the position, and I was still 50 miles north of the equator. So when I got to the Galapagos, which I found them because of the radio direction signal, my finder worked. I was able to home in on the big island and get in and meet up with some friends I'd made in Panama. And I felt comfortable. These friends I'd made good enough friends with them to feel comfortable with admitting this problem. If I'd missed the Galapagos Islands, it would have been 3,000 miles to the next group of islands, and it's the islands in the South Pacific. There's reefs everywhere. I needed to figure out the navigation. This was a problem. So what's this? So I sat down with them. I got out all my old calculations, and why'd that thing go on here? There we go. Okay. So I figured, I took all my calculations out and brought it over to their boat, and they had a sat nav that worked, and it turned out that I was showing them what to do because I could do it inside out now. I had the formula down, and the reason why it wasn't working was beyond me. And it turned out that it was my sextant. I'd been using a plastic sextant because they're much easier to use, a lot lighter, and everything was in one screen instead of a split screen. And I had a perfectly good metal sextant living in a locker that I never bothered taking out. I just figured it was my math. That was me, the problem, and not the sextant. And once I got out that other sextant and aligned it, my navigation was spot on. It was beautiful. And that was a highlight of the trip. And that's something that's missing nowadays from any sailing story, is having to find your way with the sextant. The suspense is gone. For those 2.5 years, I had that moment every day to look forward to around noon, where I could pinpoint on the ocean where I was and find out exactly how far I had gone and what course I had been on for the last 24 hours. And it really structured the days, and it gave this connection with the universe that you just don't get when you press a little button or look at your screen, or it's like a video game now, navigating. But back then it was really a connection to the charts, to the heavens. And I'm not very, math minded. So all that movement, the celestial movement and the way the earth turned, sank in and was understandable because I did it every day, and I was following the numbers in the almanacs, and I loved it. I actually, once I figured it out, I was very proud that I figured it out. And it was also a really fun conversation in harbors, because that's what everybody else was doing too. So we'd always have our conversations about when we took our sites and what time were the best ones and what stars we used. Anyway, onward. I got to visit the Galapagos for a little bit, only because the engine was broken, and the poor captain let me stay until we figured out, my friends that were helping figured out that it was the fuel injector and that we couldn't fix it. So I wasn't going to have an engine until Tahiti. So charged up the batteries as well as possible before leaving, visited a little bit the islands, and then took off for 3,000 miles. And on this South Pacific crossing, it was 24 days to do the 3,000 miles, which was really good time for little Varuna. I had beautiful sunrises and sunsets. I had figured out the navigation and was feeling really pumped about doing that. I celebrated my 19th birthday out there. I had a guitar. I learned how to play House of the Rising Sun on it, and then the thing started delaminating. I wrote lots of letters. I sent them home. Well, as I wrote the letters, it always made me think that it gave me a connection to home, and imagining people reading them meant that I got to somewhere where I could mail them. There was like a psychological advantage with writing a lot out there to people about whether I'd get to the next landfall or not. I set up the camera and took pictures with me and Dingy pretending to be asleep here. And the most beautiful part about this trip, it was gorgeous. It was force 3 downwind the whole way on these gentle waves, and whales and dolphins, and making landfall in the Marquesas was amazing. That's pretty much what I had dreamed of before leaving, was making landfalls like this. First, it was trade wind passages and landfalls in paradise. And Fatu Hiva here and the Marquesas were just beautiful. I mean, there were very few boats there, and every anchorage was another postcard. And the people were so nice. It was this blend of French and Polynesian culture, and everywhere you went, there was grapefruits and mangoes and papayas and other vegetables and fruits, just people giving. Oh, the big avocados. I remember those too. It was delicious. Another beautiful anchorage. We sailed a little bit around the islands. I met up with my friends that I had made in Panama and met up again with in the Galapagos. They were here as well. And we sailed around and did hikes in the mountains. And to the people that are considering French Polynesia, that trip that you just got offered, that is one of my favorite places I've ever been. And I've been back. It's really a memorable and beautiful place to go. While I was going between the islands, though, I also called home when possible. So back then, also, in order to be in touch with the home front, I'd have to find a telephone office and go in and place a collect call, and it would take several minutes for the operator to put it through, and then I would be talking to whoever was home and had accepted the charges. So it was here that I called my mother and found out that they'd gotten a 24-hour nurse for her, and that she was pretty ill now. So I left the Marquesas and sailed down to Tahiti through the Tuamotus, and got to Tahiti and got on an airplane pretty quickly and went back home to New York and spent 2 weeks there with my mother, knowing I was probably never going to see her again because she wasn't going to last until I got home. In addition to not knowing if I was ever going to even get home. Just being home with the familiarity of all my friends and family being there and the streets I knew, it was lovely to be home and to be surrounded by the known after having faced months of the unknown. And to get back on that airplane and go back to Tahiti was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And when I got back there, it was rainy season and the cat wasn't using his kitty litter. And I was very depressed and just moped around and cried for weeks until I got the news from home that my mother had died. And that things changed after that. And it was like a signal for me to keep on going. I was convinced of how much she wanted me to do this and how proud she was. And she had stayed alive longer than she probably would have had I not gone off. This gave her something to hang on to. So anyway, one of the first things I did was get another cat. This is Mimi, and it was a Tahitian girlfriend for Dingy. And I pretty soon learned what a dumb thing it is to have 2 cats on a 26-foot boat. But anyway, she was cute and photogenic. And I made friends with another American girl, Margot, who spoke English. I didn't have to use my rusty French to make myself understood. And just having a friend who was close to my age was so invaluable to just getting through those next couple months. Just to have a friend to talk to and sail around with. And I did a lot of work on Varuna. Like I got the solar panel back here that where's my little cursor? I got the solar panel that I mounted on the back here. I made that bed inside the cockpit, in the salon. The engine got taken out and completely refurbished by a local mechanic. Oh, I made cushion covers. I don't know. I really nested there. I had 5 months in Tahiti waiting for hurricane season to blow over. So I made friends, and that's probably partly why I loved it there so much, was all the friends too. The stories from them. But then the local Yamaha dealer said that they'd give me a outboard engine in return for pictures of my departure. So I had to set a date to leave. And one of the things this picture was taken at some other part, actually I know where, in Sri Lanka, but whenever I got anywhere, I would take the entire boat apart, pull everything out into the cockpit, clean it, and put it back in again. But this was also the picture that I have of me aligning the sextant, so I threw it in here. That was one of the things that I learned to do. Every time I was ready to head back out to sea, I needed to align the sextant while the horizon was steady and I wasn't bouncing around on little Varuna. And then the last thing to do before leaving anywhere was to deflate the dinghy between Tahiti and Australia. Actually, no, it's between Tahiti and the Suez Canal. I was never tied up to shore. I always had to get to shore with this little Avon. So once it was deflated and stowed on deck, I was as good as gone. And really, one of the hardest things to do was to make that final decision to go up forward onto the foredeck, pull up the anchor, and head off into the unknown. Once I was out there, I had this process that I called, the going through withdrawal, which was withdrawal from civilization. The first 3 days out there, just being by myself and being back on the ocean again, stripped of all the sights and sounds and smells of being among people, took a radical adjusting. It was like stopping smoking, or just a withdrawal from anything that's difficult. I was emotional, I was crying, I was shaky, I'd have weird dreams. But then after 3 days, kind of just settled into the routine, and time became fluid. And I definitely had lows, but without those lows, you couldn't have the highs. And I had a lot of highs too. There were just a lot of really beautiful, special moments out there where I realized how lucky I was to be doing that, and what a beautiful planet we live on. And that I was in one of the last great wildernesses of being on the ocean. So anyway, I took the dinghy apart and sailed on to Moorea, which was only 20 miles away from where I was in Tahiti, and spent 2 weeks there procrastinating leaving. And then finally I was like, I gotta go. My provisioning was getting used up and the time was ticking. I ended up leaving on a Friday, and we all know that leaving on a Friday is bad as far as seagoing superstitions go. And if I hadn't left on that Friday, I would have gotten the earache I was going to get that night. I would have gone to the doctor the next morning, and I would have gotten some antibiotics or whatever. And then I would have heard about the depression that was lurking to the west. And instead, I got out there, I had the earache, I got into the storm, and it took me, I don't know, 18 days to get to American Samoa from there. And that was the trip I called this one the trip from hell. And it was between Moorea and American Samoa. So one of the worst things that happened out there is I was scratching my head one day and I found lice, and they were dropping on the chart in front of me. And I'd survived the New York City public school system without ever getting any. And this was just, it was disgusting. And I spent months in different marina harbors later, sneaking into the showers at night with the medicinal shampoos, trying to get rid of it, too embarrassed to tell anyone. And finally, it wasn't until Vanuatu that I put kerosene in my hair, and that got rid of it. That was the final trick. None of those shampoos worked, because without somebody there to help comb through the hair, I couldn't get rid of them. Oh, and then a bottle of grenadine syrup cracked. The cats never used their kitty litter. Rotten egg fell on my bunk and cracked open. It was just a miserable trip. And the trades were just really strong. We were just being buffeted around and swamped nonstop. And I was very happy to get to American Samoa. And then so I went, this is just the chart here, the map, got to American Samoa, and then went to Western Samoa, and then Wallis and Futuna Islands, and then on across to Vanuatu, and then across the Coral Sea to Cairns in Australia, and up the Great Barrier Reef to Thursday Island. Next part of the trip. So I spent, a couple weeks in what American and Western Samoa, and made friends in Western Samoa with another French boat, with whom I then went to Wallis and Futuna Island. So I saw a side of the Pacific I wouldn't have seen if I hadn't made friends with them, because I tended to gravitate to places where I knew I'd see people I know, and I didn't like to go. I didn't want to be alone and be the only boat. And so I got to Wallis Island, which was, well, this is on Futuna, and there were like 1,000 people who lived on it, and they were all involved in the construction of this enormous cathedral, and they were hoping the Pope would come for opening ceremonies. And the next door island of Wallis, I was there there were 3 kingdoms fit into this small island. It was like 12 miles long, 7 miles wide. And there were 3 kingdoms, and there was this ongoing competition to be the most beautiful. And I was there during one of the kingdom's annual festivities, and they were actually out there racing these pirogues in the lagoon that day. But that wasn't just for that festival. They would do that every day. They were still sailing their boats out there to go fishing. So this is the only time I ever saw that, without big outboards attached to the back of these pirogues, where people were still sailing the way they had for millennia. It was so cool to be there and to have the opportunity to see that. I said goodbye to them and sailed on to Vanuatu, where I ended up meeting Olivier, who ended up being my husband and the father of my kids. And he was on another boat. People always said, how did you meet? I anchored next to him. I said hello. He said hello. And that's how we met. And the difference is that when you're about to set back out to sea, a romance can accelerate. It can get to a point where, well, it did get to the point where before we left Vanuatu, we were saying that we were going to be married and come back there in 50 years for our 50th wedding anniversary. But and 13 years later, we were divorced. But this was also, I got Dingy, the black and white cat. He developed a urinary disease, a bladder disease that male cats will get, and he had to be put to sleep there. So I got this little guy, Tarzoon, who joined Mean, and he came back and he moved up to Vermont with us eventually. He lived to be 21. So between Olivier, who I met in Vanuatu, and Tarzoon, I used to like to say I found 2 animals in Vanuatu, and Tarzoon outlasted the marriage. So the next landfall was the big test of my navigation. I had to find a lighthouse sticking up out of the reef that led to indicated the entrance to the Great Barrier Reef. And I was pretty nervous. And the day that I thought I was going to find it, I did. I found it was like finding a pencil sticking up in the middle of the ocean, and there weren't really any ships out there to check my positions against. And I found that lighthouse, and that was a really huge eureka moment. But then I started heading in just as this front came through, and I was inside the reef trying to sail into behind the barrier reef, and the rain was pelting, the wind was howling, there were reefs crashing on both sides of the Varuna, and I turned around and I went back out to sea, and I spent the next couple days out there pacing back and forth, waiting for the weather to get better, swearing the only way I was going to get home was on a 747. This was the low point officially. And when I got into into Cairns, I was ready to throw in the towel. But then I got some sleep, and then I realized, how do you quit this huge thing? Quitting, the words are a lot easier to say than actually pull it off. I mean, what was I going to do with the boat? What was I going to do with the cats? How was I going to tell my dad I was quitting? What was I going to tell everybody when I got home about why I quit? I mean, short of a disaster, I really couldn't quit. I had to keep going. And another thing happened is that Olivier, who had said that he was going to stop in Australia, decided he didn't want to separate, and he would sail on back to Europe in tandem with me. So we would be able to see each other in anchorages along the way. And one more thing was, I had always assumed that I was going to go from Thursday Island down to South Africa. So in order to get down to South Africa before hurricane season, it would have been 6,000 miles nonstop. The Indian Ocean has a reputation for being pretty gnarly and windy, and the Cape of Good Hope is another, no piece of cake either. And I got a cruising guide that showed us this route that took us up through the Arabian Sea, north of the equator in the Indian Ocean to Sri Lanka, and then on up the Red Sea. And that was about 4,000 miles shorter in the entirety of going around the world, then going around the Cape of Good Hope. And I had more stops along the way. And Olivier saying that he was going to also do that same itinerary, and me not having to do the 6,000 miles nonstop really changed my attitude also. So anyway, so the next part of the trip was from Thursday Island across to Bali, and then to Christmas Island, back north across the equator to Sri Lanka, and then across the Arabian Sea to Djibouti, and then on up the Red Sea. This picture was taken. I had a whole bunch. I used to have many. I used to pack the slideshow with more pictures, but they faded and whatever. And I kept this one. I didn't put in the kangaroos and the wombats and the other Australian animals. I kept this one because of Michel, this guy next to me. And he was a huge part of why I also kept on going. He was a Frenchman who had bought his little day sailor thing in on the west coast of Africa and had fiberglassed it over and sailed it across the Atlantic to Brazil. And he'd gone from Brazil to Venezuela to Colombia to the San Blas Islands to Panama. And he always had crew with other boat hippie types with him. And they got through the Panama Canal. I think a boat towed him through because he didn't have an engine. And then on the other side of the canal, he got hit by lightning in an anchorage. The boat sank, and him and the two people that were on the boat with him, they lifted the boat back onto the beach, fixed it, put it in the water, and he continued to sail across the entire Pacific. And right before we got to Australia, I had just met him in Vanuatu also. And right before we got to Australia, that front that came through, it had given him that I had been just pacing outside of the barrier reef, waiting for it to pass. He'd gotten a knockdown and he lost all these cockpit covers. He decided he was done with it. And he was going on another Frenchman's boat, and they were going to go up to Papua New Guinea or something. Anyway, but he just had all these great stories, and he was so, into all this adversity and overcoming it. And he just had the crappiest little boat and was having the grandest time. I was feeling really petulant about my complaints and my nice boat and having this grand opportunity. So that was another huge part of continuing instead of quitting, was just seeing, having a little wake up call, like seeing this guy, getting the sleep, and realizing that, I was having a great adventure. Why would I quit unless there was a disaster? And there hadn't been a disaster yet. So Olivier sailed up the Great Barrier Reef. We sailed in tandem. We stopped at night and behind different reefs. And this is the only fish I ever harpooned. And it was lucky we got the picture. I went to ask another boat in the anchorage if it was a safe one to eat, because you have to watch out with the reef poisoning, the ciguatera. And I found out that it was indeed safe to eat, but I caught it in an underwater national park. So I never caught one again. This fish thought he was safe. This was the last night on the Great Barrier Reef. Olivier had told me to get off the boat, and I came back. When I came back, he had arranged 20 shells around some gifts. It was my 20th birthday, and I'll say that my 19th birthday was in the middle of the South Pacific between the Galapagos and Marquesas. My 20th was the last night on the Great Barrier Reef, and my 21st was in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean on the way back to New York at the end. So those 3 birthdays are considered your coming of age years, 18 to 21. This story was called My Coming of Age Story. And those 3 birthdays are moments that I will never forget. All the years, they just kind of go in a blur. The one birthday comes and goes, but those 3 really were the milestones of a lifetime. I left Thursday Island. Olivia and I both left at the same time, and pretty quickly had no wind. It was a couple, I don't remember. It was like 2-3 days later, the wind died completely. We didn't bother trying to stay within sight of each other. He didn't have a VHF radio or proper navigation lights, but at the end of the second or third day, whatever it was, the wind died. And overnight it was a flat calm. In the morning, I woke up and saw a mast on the horizon, and I turned on the engine and motored over to it, and it was Olivier. And so we tied the boats together with a really long rope and just spent the next 3 days waiting for the wind to come back, swimming back and forth between the boats. It was hysterical. Every time I'd swim over to Olivier's boat, the cats would jump in the water and swim over with me, and vice versa. They'd come right back, both cats. This water, it was so hot. The sun was directly overhead. It was roasty toasty, and there were snakes swimming around the boat, turtles, jellyfish, the mahi-mahi swimming under the boat. Everybody was going somewhere except for us. We were just bobbing around there, wallowing. And at the end of the second or third day, the second day maybe, I saw a Coast Guard cutter on the horizon that was coming toward us. And immediately I thought, oh God, you're not allowed to tie two boats together in the middle of the ocean. We're in trouble. But nope, they actually just came over to see how we were doing, and gave us a block of ice and a half gallon of ice cream and a weather report, and then tootled on. And years later, I got a letter from the captain of the Coast Guard cutter. He'd been given the book, and in reading it, I described this experience, and he remembered that, and he just wanted to reach out and let me know that he remembered clearly that day when they saw us, and how much he wished he could be on a little sailboat sailing off into the horizon. So I immediately whipped out my typewriter, because whenever, and wrote back. It was probably a fax, and faxed him back that I could still remember how much I wished I could have been him on his Coast Guard cutter with his air conditioning and steak for dinner, but grass is always greener. So we spent the next 24 days or so. This trip was 28 days from Thursday Island to Bali, and we managed to stay within sight of each other. Olivier had a steel boat, so he'd have to put up all his light wind sails, and I just kept a reef in my mainsail and the jib to go the same speed as he. Varuna was much faster, and we developed a system, a watch schedule, so that we would bring the boats close together or have flashlight signals if we needed to communicate, because like I said, he didn't have any VHF. So sleep wasn't as good as it could have been out there, and we got into some of our first arguments about who was late on watch and whatnot. But this was also where Tarzoon met his first bird. So the first year of his life, he never got off the boat, and I had a harness that I put on him, well, particularly on this day, because I was scared that with this bird, he'd get up on the solar panel and fly off the back of the boat. And right after I took this picture, the bird pecked him in the face, and he went down below, and he wouldn't come out until the bird left the next day. But on this passage, Tarzan actually did fall overboard at one point, and I managed to turn the boat around, and the little guy, he paddled back to the boat and got on again. He used up more than 9 lives, this kitty. He fell overboard again in the Indian Ocean, and it was a flat calm. So he had fallen overboard and got back on the boat and woke me up by shaking himself out on me. So I never even knew he did until he got back on. Landfall was in Bali, and Bali is another place like the Galapagos where you're not allowed to stay without a cruising permit, but because the engine was broken, the poor captain let us spend a week there and trying to fix it. Oh, yeah, I forgot. Yeah, the engine broke again. So I was trying to fix it, and we visited a little bit the island there before heading off to Christmas Island. So I did have to hurry because, well, Olivier too, actually, because the hurricane season was nipping at our heels. Actually arrived in Christmas Island here on the first day, the first official day of hurricane season in the Indian Ocean. So there was pressure to get back north across the equator ASAP. So, well, when I got to Christmas Island, one of the first things people showed me were pictures of what happens to this anchorage when a hurricane hits. So that kind of lit a fire too. This was the last European supermarket. It's an Australian outpost. So I did my last provisioning with Western food until the Mediterranean. And the trip from Christmas Island up to Sri Lanka was it was 30 days, an even longer trip. And I had to cross the equator, the doldrums, the engine stopped working. And by the time I figured out what the problem was, my fuel had siphoned into the bilge. And it was just a very big, a wide doldrum belt of getting across using just thunderstorms and little tiny breezes. I read all the books on the boat. I'd run out of all the trashy novels, and I'd been driven to the classics by this point. And so this trip, a lot of the trips were marked by the book I was reading at the time. So this passage was Les Miserables. I was in the sewers of Paris as I was trying to get across the equator. Flat calm from the cockpit. And this was a flat calm picture that Olivier must have taken at some point, but it's just a show. I mean, flat calms are almost worse than sometimes, almost worse than too much wind, because you're really going nowhere. And the banging of the sails and the not going anywhere can make it crazy. I had Christmas and New Year's out there, and by the time I got to Sri Lanka, I there's a ship's agent there who hosted all the sailors that came in. And when I went ashore, I found out that my father had been calling to check to see if I had arrived yet. And he'd bought a ticket to come to Sri Lanka to form a search and rescue mission because I was so overdue. But I know also, definitely, in hindsight, that I had written a telegram in Christmas Island saying that Olivia and I were going to get married on an elephant in Sri Lanka. And it was a joke, but he didn't think it was funny. So he came, he wanted to meet Olivier, and he also wanted to see me. I hadn't seen him since Bermuda. So there were a lot of stories to tell. He'd been off doing his midlife crisis stuff, and I was having the adventure he wished he could have had. So there was a lot to tell each other. And also to see, this was a tea plantation, and I'm a tea drinker. So that was great to see that. And to travel around Sri Lanka a little bit. Everywhere there were Buddhas. Here were the little Buddhas. It's considered the seat of Buddhism, Sri Lanka. And it was really a beautiful place. The mountains and the seashore, and then the Buddhist temples. That was a small Buddha. Here was a big Buddha. And this was a labyrinth of hallways inside the big Buddha with paintings depicting moments from the Buddha's life. It was lovely. And I also hauled Varuna out here just to check on, make sure everything was okay underneath, and to give another coat of anti-fouling. It was really cheap and easy to do a haul out here. So the next part of the trip was from Sri Lanka across the Arabian Sea to Djibouti and on up the Red Sea, stopping in Sudan, south of the Suez, Egypt, and south of the Gulf of Suez and Hurghada, up to the Suez Canal, Crete, Malta, Spain, Gibraltar, and then back across the North Atlantic home to New York. In Sri Lanka, it was one of those bottlenecks like the Panama Canal, where all the boats that were heading east or west, and at this time of the year, it was all the boats that were heading west from Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. They were meeting here to make the passage across the Arabian Sea and then on up the Red Sea, because it was the right time of year to do this. So everybody's telling stories and worrying about the Red Sea because of the pirates and the reefs and the shipping that wasn't looking out for little boats. And one day, 70-foot yawl came in missing its mizzenmast. It had been hit by a cargo ship. So of course, back then, cruising boats were all like 42 was a big boat. So everybody was on their little boats worried about the next couple months of getting up the Red Sea. So the Arabian Sea was my last nice passage. It was beautiful. It was the monsoon, the winds with the northeast monsoon over there. And it was fair weather all the way across. And I think it was like 27 days to get to Djibouti. Olivier and I didn't bother trying to stay within sight of each other for these trips anymore. It was too much work. And one of the things that was happening between Bali and Sri Lanka and now North Africa was the culture shock. I used to call being out in the ocean void. Also, I'd go through that withdrawal and accepting the void. So it was really stripped down stimulation down to just me, my boat, and the ocean and the sky and the wind. And then to just land in these radically different countries each time was a blast of culture shock every time. So yeah, going from Sri Lanka, which was Buddhism, down to the desert and jungle and tea plantations and just jungle, to North Africa, which is desert and Islam. And it was interesting for sure. There was a lot of learning to do. And in Djibouti, I had to take my engine in and out of the boat 2 times because I had another problem. And there was the French Navy there that was helping the mechanics there. They were really nice and helped try to figure out the problem. And also some guys on shore. It was a starter problem, and then it was a stern tube problem, and it was just a bunch of problems. And I ended up leaving, not sure if the problems had been fixed, but whatever. By this time, I knew that I wasn't going to rely on the engine, that it was going to be sailing. I had a sailboat. But in this picture here, Len is behind me, and he was this Englishman who had been in Aden, just across the Gulf of Aden from Djibouti. And when he left, he'd left with a little scratch on his leg that had gone septic, and a red streak started shooting up his leg pretty quickly as soon as he left Aden. So he had pulled into Djibouti, and we spent 2 weeks there. We spent visiting him in the hospital, and then he was a single-hander, and we decided we would sail in tandem up the Red Sea, him, Olivier, and I. We'd be 3 boats, maybe 3 blips would show up better on a radar, and for ships, and pirates would think, if there were pirates, they'd think twice before attacking 3 boats, whatever. Anyway, we decided we would sail together. And at the last minute, Len took on a passenger and we all left. And this is the entrance to the to the Red Sea, called the Straits of Bab el Mandab, which translates into the gates of tears, hell, or lamentations. So we left the harbor and Len's boat lagged behind, but he had by far the nicest, fastest boat. So we just kept on going. And this picture Olivier took right as I had to take down all the sails because my mainsail ripped. And then I lost him overnight. And the wind was just howling through the straits. It just funneled in, the whole northeast monsoon funneled in the straits. And I got carried, I forget, like 40 miles north in the right direction, at least overnight. And in the morning, I was container ship narrowly missed hitting me. And we'd made a tentative rendezvous in this group of islands that I only had photocopies charts for, and they were uninhabited. And I got close to them and they looked just really sinister and unfriendly. And I was like, you know what? I'm not going there. I'm going to keep going, and they'll figure it out, and they'll meet me up in Port Sudan. So I left and I met up with a group of 3 other boats on the way north, and I stayed with them up until I got to Port Sudan. And I got into the harbor, and another boat from Djibouti hollered over hello, somebody I recognized, and they asked if I'd heard the news. And it turned out that Len, the Englishman that we had planned to sail in tandem with, outside of Djibouti harbor, the boom had jibed, hit him in the head, and killed him. And that was, up until this point, my first experience with sudden, the end. Everything is fine 1 minute and over the next. And Olivier still wasn't in the harbor. And I realized on the way up from Djibouti to Port Sudan that I still had his passport and boat papers on my boat. When we checked out, we just forgot to give it back to him. In one of the most paper mad corners of the world. So that whole night, I was just very shaken and praying to I stayed up all night watching for shooting stars to pray to them. And the next day, Olivier came in. But this really changed my relationship with my own mortality. I just felt like it was something could go wrong really easily and quickly, and it would all be over. And it was just a matter of when. So we spent some time in Djibouti, in Port Sudan, which was, again, a great, experience. Another completely different culture, one of the poorest countries I visited. Yet this was the shoe shine guy. We passed by him in the market every day. They'd always ask us to sit down. It would shine always multiple times shine the strap on my flip-flop sandal, and we just talk. I'd learn some Arabic, they'd learn some English, they'd bring some Coca-Cola, and we would just talk. And while we were there, also the president of Sudan arrived at the local airport, and we went out along with all these other people. There was like all these caravans that parked on the perimeter of the city, and all these tribal members would come in with their camels. They parked their camels, and they'd come in these flowing robes with muskets and swords attached. And with all those people, we went out to the airport, and it was just unforgettable. I don't have pictures of that. Nobody likes to have their pictures taken there. These guys, I'm bad at taking pictures anyway. And when people don't like having pictures, that's fine with me. I'm not taking any. So it's all up in here now. I have to remember that. But it was like being in Arabian Nights. We were invited to an Islamic wedding, which was the only time I saw the women unveiled. It was beautiful. It was a very cool place, and it was hard to leave there. I loved everywhere I went. You're probably gathering that there's nothing, I don't have any complaints about my landfalls. I loved it. Everything had its cool aspect, and it was all just amazing for this young 20 and 21 year 19 20 21 year old person to see. So I left the Port Sudan, and the next 2 weeks were spent making only 250 miles in the right direction. It was tacking back and forth. The Red Sea from Port Sudan north has headwinds, and pretty strong ones often. So I was just tacking out to Saudi Arabia, back to Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, across the shipping lanes. And the sail was taking reefs in and out, and wind was just going anywhere from 15 to 35 knots, and so sometimes no sails. And this mainsail kept ripping, so I spent hours out there with the rubber cement, needle and thread, patching the sail, praying that it would make it to Suez, because I had telegrammed my father in Port Sudan and said my sail wasn't going to make it back to New York. If there was any way to get a new one to Port Suez, that would be great. So we made it to the and Olivier and I managed to stay together for this. We did the tacking. It was easier when you were sailing into the wind to stay within sight of each other. So we tacked back and forth for those 2 weeks to make 250 miles to Ras Banyas, which was the southernmost outpost of Egypt. And so we'd heard all these horror stories about the bureaucracy in Egypt, and these were the guys that were on the border between Egypt and Sudan, patrolling the border. And these guys did not care about our passports or anything. All they wanted to do was hang out, hear stories, play cards, and drink tea. So we obliged and hung out there for a couple days, but still had to keep on going. I got up to Port Suez, where my dad had left a message with the port captain saying that I was so overdue again, that he'd rented a car, driven down the coast of Egypt looking for a ship to Varuna, decided I was just dilly-dallying, and he went on a side trip to Israel, that I should wait for him. So when he came back, he really took up the mantra of me dilly-dallying. He's like, this is a job. This isn't a vacation. And you've been taking your time. You're going to be crossing the Atlantic in the winter. You're going to get the storm. You got to hurry. You got to hurry. And I kept telling him it was the Red Sea. And he's like, blah, blah. So the first day we set sail from Hurghada to head north, he went on Olivier's boat. And we made 10 miles in the right direction that day. So that night in the anchorage, he's like, oh, you're not going, your problem is you're not taking out enough reef. If you would take out a reef, you could point higher and go faster. So the next day, Olivier let him take out the reef, and his sail immediately ripped like 6 foot along the seam. So that was one of those, there were certain highlights on the trip. This was a big one too, was sitting there in the my cockpit, watching my dad out on Olivier's boat, sewing that sail back together. So he left into it. He had brought the sail, and he did leave me with the words ringing in my ears about hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. So we got through the Suez Canal. It's a 2-day trip. He left at the midway point to get back to New York in time for my brother's high school graduation. And I got to the other side of the canal and spent some time there getting ready for the rest of the Mediterranean. And we ended up leaving on a Friday again. And that was because Olivier had made endless fun of me not wanting to leave on Fridays. It was a French superstition, says you do never say the word rabbit on a boat. And so we couldn't say rabbit on the boat. But my superstition for not wanting to leave on Fridays was just silly. So it was his birthday. It was July 3rd. So I figured, okay, that can't be such bad luck. And we left. And that was the night I got hit by a ship. And this wasn't the actual encounter. This was another close encounter in the Red Sea that Olivier got a picture of, because it was dusk when it happened. I'd been steering all day. There were ships coming in and out of the canal zone. Mist fell as night fell, and I went down below to heat up some water for a coffee. So the water hadn't even boiled yet when I heard this blast. And I ran out on deck, and there was this ship coming out of the mist right for me. And I thought of all the things I would do, of course, if this ever happened. I would jump overboard and get out of the way of the ship's propellers, or I would quickly tack out of the way, or turn on the engine and get out of the way, whatever. I didn't do anything. I just stood there and watched. It happens fast. And the ship came by, and Varuna was so small that we got glanced alongside the hull of the ship, but something at the end snagged the forestay and broke it. But I had noticed fraying strands in my forestay earlier, and I tied a halyard down to the bow roller. So that probably saved the mast from snapping back. Anyway, and I was able to change the forestay. I had a spare one, and get to Crete, where I needed to refuel there. And then on to Malta, which was the place where Olivier was stopping his trip. He was going to leave the boat in Malta, fly back to Switzerland and see his family, and then eventually meet me in New York. So I spent several weeks in Malta, and by this point, I was at the skinniest I've ever been in my life. I was down to below 100 pounds. I was exhausted. I went to a doctor. He said I was borderline anemic. I just hadn't been sleeping in the Red Sea after the ship encounter. I just couldn't sleep anymore. I was frightened of getting hit by another ship, and there were so many boats out there all going in every direction. There weren't any like precise shipping lanes like in the major oceans. So by the time I got to Malta, I just needed to rest and eat. And I did. Oh, there's the 2 sides of the forestay that got repaired, my jury rig. And this is one of the last pictures with Olivier, our family pictures. His family was all his shells. Every time we anchored anywhere or stopped somewhere, he'd take his shells out and count them and fondle them. He loved his shells, and he had a lot of beautiful ones. And I cleaned out Varuna there because he was leaving here, and I was gonna do the last 4,000 miles to get to New York with Varuna in as good shape as I could make her in Malta. My brother came and he helped me also do a bunch of, tweaking. There was just a lot. There was always something to fix. All of you guys have boats. You know that there's always stuff breaking. There were always things to fix. So in Malta, in between eating and resting, I was fixing up Varuna and getting ready for that last crossing of the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic. Oh, and Mimi, the Tahitian cat, she jumped ship in Egypt. She got off of the boat and went with another Swiss boat actually that had a cook on board. She decided she wanted to be with them. And later I heard that boat had caught fire off the east coast of Africa, and Mimi ended up in Switzerland. So that was the end of Mimi, and Tarzoon continued with me. So the trip from Malta to Spain was epic. Again, I would read books that would define the trip for me. So I was not sleeping, I wasn't eating properly, and fatigue was getting the best of me. And I was reading Tessa the D'Urbervilles, and she was just the heroine trudging all over England from one tragedy to another. And I started identifying with her. And I wasn't eating properly. I was eating salted pumpkin seeds and powdered tang by the spoonful, and I started playing solitaire like a freak. Like every time I lost a game of solitaire, that meant I was going to die. So I'd have to play however many games it took to win again, to decide if I was going to, make my a meal, to go out and change the sails. And the wind was just constantly changing, and it was always changing downwind. So I was constantly jibing the spinnaker pole and the mainsail, going through that whole rigmarole. And finally, at the end of a week, the wind started, it came steady and stronger, and the miles were ticking by faster as the day went on. And by evening, there was this long, low black cloud on the horizon. But I was happy. I didn't have to go out there and change the sails, and we were heading in the right direction and fast. And we got underneath that cloud, and I've never seen anything like it since. The wind picked up at this point. It was howling, and there was lightning just shooting across the sky every direction. Tons of lightning. There was no thunder, and there was no rain. It was just this lightning and howling wind. And that night I just kept rounding up. I kept broaching. I had the storm jib up and had taken down the mainsail, but still it was too windy, and I just kept rounding up. And I was like, you know what? I'm done. I'm taking all the sails down, and I'm gonna go to sleep. And when I wake up, this better be gone. And I literally did that. I went down below. I didn't really close anything up. Oh, stock footage. Yeah, I have pictures of lightning and wind whipped waves. I'm sure you've all tried to take pictures of the ocean. Well, nowadays we can take videos with our phones too, but just it's never the same as being there in person and having that ocean around you. The pictures just don't do it. But I woke up at first I thought I'd been hit square on by a ship this time, because there was a big crash and a wall of water came flying in through the companionway. Everything on the starboard side of Runa came crashing down on me, and the boat was full of water. And I ran out on deck, and I saw that my spray hood had been ripped off, that everything I'd left out in the cockpit had washed overboard, the solar panel had been ripped away. I saw a boat on the horizon, and I was like, this is it, I'm sinking. And I went to pump the bilge, and the bilge it clogged something, it didn't work anymore. So I saw that boat, and I was like, that's it, I'm done. And this is the disaster. And I activated the EPIRB and sat there and found a airplane-sized bottle of whiskey that I'd been saving for emergencies, and sat there and drank that and calmed down a little bit, and that boat kept on going. It didn't turn around. And meanwhile, I'd been thinking, like, how do you get on a boat and with all this wind, and what do you take with you? Will I be able to take Tarzoon with me? What am I, whatever. There was just the logistics of abandoning the boats were very preoccupying. And I calmed down and I started bailing out the boat with a bucket, and I figured out the bilge pump had just, when we got the knockdown, something in a locker had crimped the hose. So once I uncrimped it, I could pump out the bilge again. And I got to Spain, cleaned out the boat on the way there. I had no more fuel. I had to sail into Spain. And when I got there, I went to a telephone office and tried to place the collect call to my dad, and it took all day because the international operators were on strike. And this office was super air conditioned. I was freezing. I still hadn't slept. I was like a basket case. When I finally got through to my dad, I was just sobbing, and I said, I can't do this. I'm not even 21 yet. I don't want to die. I can't. I'm done. And he's like, you sound tired, actually. Why don't you get a good night of sleep and call me tomorrow, and I'll come to Gibraltar and help you too. So of course he was right. I did need my good night of sleep, and I did sleep. I slept a couple nights and then went, or whatever. I slept enough to be able to get from Spain to Gibraltar in one piece. And this was the one time where I didn't even have a VHF radio, the RDF, everything had turned green. The wave had, the water coming in. It had been a knockdown. It wasn't a ship. I just got knocked down by a wave. And, everything I didn't have any more electronics. So I had to find Gibraltar completely with the sextant alone. So that was kind of cool. And, in Gibraltar, there was my dad. There was another guy who had, come across the Atlantic on Varuna's sister ship, another Contessa 26. There was a friend of the family on his 38-foot rival there too. So I had friends and my dad helping me really clean her up and get her ready for the last crossing of the North Atlantic. And I got rid of all the stuff that I wasn't going to ever need again, the spare anchor, the dinghy, just lightened up the load too, cleaned out everything. Everything had gotten soaked into salt water. So everything had to come out of the boat and get rinsed in fresh water and restowed. And there's Tarzoon helping me. And I left. I left on September 16th, 1987. Or was it the 18th? What I do know for sure is that this last passage was 50 days nonstop. And it was my longest passage ever. And this was my 21st birthday meal. It's a little out of focus, but I never gotten rid of it in this slideshow because I was coming home an adult, and I had my worst storm on Varuna ever out there. I don't know how much wind there was, but I do know that when I was in the bottom of the troughs, the waves were above the mast, and Varuna's mast was 30 feet high. The waves were massive, but we were going downwind. So it was probably because we were in with Gulf Stream waters or in an eddy anyway, with the wind against the current, we were getting even bigger waves. And then I also had my longest flat calm ever, which was an entire week straight, during which I had my 21st birthday. Saw my first pod of truly gigantic whales and turned on the engine to get away from them. And the engine conked out and I broke it for the last time trying to fix it. Everything I knew I was doing for the last time. So it was a challenging trip in many ways, but it was also the last one. So everything I knew, I was never going to have to get on a boat again if I didn't want to. And this was the end of my big adventure. And when I got close to New York, I started worrying. I'm a worrier, and I've always said that boats are a really good place to be if you're a worrywart, because they give you endless things to worry about. So out there, I started worrying about what it would mean to get back to New York. Here I was, 21 years old. I had just circumnavigated. What do you do with life after that? What kind of questions were people going to ask? It was a huge, big question mark waiting for me at New York, where for 2.5 years, as I was going around the world, I had such clarity of purpose that I knew I was never going to have again. Every day for 2.5 years, through those years that can be hard for us when between 18 and 21, I was given the gift of knowing exactly what I needed to do every single day. And that was to head west and get home. And once I got home, now I was like, now what? I was like, oh, I should just head back to Bermuda. And the night before I was going to make it into New York, I took the sails down just to, have to prolong my moment with the sea, my last few moments. I was just out there. And if I hadn't have done that, I don't know, it was like 6 hours. I took the sails down. If I hadn't have done that, then I would have probably gotten into New York Harbor before the next gale hit. But this picture was taken by the Cruising World boat that came to get me. And I was right before I had to take down the jib because the wind was getting too strong. And they asked, when did I think I was going to get into New York Harbor? And I said, I don't I don't think I'm going to get in for a couple days until this gale blows over. And they're like, you can't do that. Tents are pitched. The champagne is on ice. We're planning your arrival tomorrow. Oh yeah. They had given me this Argo satellite transmitter thingy in Gibraltar that they were able to monitor my position while I was crossing the Atlantic. So they knew that I was there, that I was at the entrance to New York Harbor. That's how they were able to find me. And they also knew that that was how they were also able to plan the reception. That thing didn't tell me where I was, but it told them where I was. And actually, so they had to, they went back into New York Harbor, and they said they were going to send the Coast Guard out to tow me in so I could get in on time. And the Coast Guard boat that was going to come and get me had to first get them because their instrument panel caught on fire, and they had to tow them in. So I got picked up at like, I don't know, 3 a.m. and pulled into New York Harbor. And this is one of the first things I saw, that satellite transmitter, that gave my position. A couple times the sail bag had covered it. Since it didn't give me my position, I didn't really pay much attention to whether or not the sun was hitting it. And so if a sail bag was covering it or whatever, I didn't care. And so sometimes it didn't give my position. So the New York Post had decided it was going to publish my position every day with some little tidbit about my life. And we all know that the New York Post has never set any literary standard. So not only did they decide I was lost at sea after a couple of days of not getting a position, but then they also said it happened in shark infested waters, which is funny now, but it wasn't funny for the family and friends who actually didn't know where I was then. And it was a good picture when I got there. So my friend from Cruising World had met me in Gibraltar, and she'd given me a list of questions that I could expect to be asked when I got to New York. And I'd written down the answers while I was there and able to think through them so I could give fully formed answers to all the questions instead of repeating what I had done when I left New York, which was just say it over and over again. Why not? Why not? I don't know. I didn't really have answers to all those existential questions that people tend to ask when you're a young girl heading off to sea by yourself. So I had answers that I practiced over 50 days. So that blur of press and questions that met me when I got home, I was prepared for. I don't remember it, but I know that I was able to answer all the questions pretty well. And at Cruising World, I thought this was funny. They gave me the medal for outstanding seamanship because I had just done so many decidedly unseaman-like things along the way that I was pretty proud of it too. But my dad, while I was crossing the Atlantic, he loved to say that Tanya's finally finishing something other than a meal. He was so confident of my ability to do anything that I set my mind to that while I was crossing the ocean, he had lined up all the sponsorship for me to do the Iditarod sled dog race that winter, which I didn't do. That was not going to happen. But Olivier was there when I got back. And let me just say with the picture of my dad here. So sadly, well, and inevitably, he passed away this past April. He was a huge influence on my life. As you can imagine, this trip was a big one. I still get a little emotional. But anyway, he's the one. So much was made of my bravery and courage as I did this trip that the credit wasn't given to him until later, that he was the one that had the faith in my ability to do this and in the potential there. He gave me an opportunity that makes him the freak of a parent, but he gave me the opportunity to do something that I was unable to do for my own kids. And I had this, like, you just saw the whole slideshow of what he gave me. And I always wanted to be able to do that for my kids. And I didn't. When Sam was 22, I had a Contessa 32. While I was out there doing this trip, I kept fantasizing about having the Contessa 32, how much greater would be to have those few extra feet. And I finally got myself one, and I had the intentions to do a trip, but then my dad got sick and I had to start taking care of him. life changed. But I decided I would take the boat back to the Caribbean to sell it where I had bought it. And I asked my son, who had just graduated from Maritime Academy, he was a marine systems engineer, and I had a fully equipped boat. And he said that he wanted to take the boat to the Caribbean for me instead of me. I had asked him if he could house it for me while I did it, and he's like, let me do it. So I said, okay. And I got him all ready down in Newport and got the boat all equipped. And then we started waiting for the weather window. It was November. And it was just one front after another coming through with the purples and the reds on passage weather. I couldn't sleep or eat or even talk thinking about my hypothermic boy being out there on the way to Bermuda. And I pulled the plug on him. I said, get a job instead. I didn't let him do it with the nice boat. And I just kept the boat in Rhode Island, and I sold it there. So yeah, so that was, my dad was a special person and made all this so possible. I ended up marrying Olivier, like I've told you, and we ended up getting divorced 13 years later, but he lives up the road from me. We're good enough friends, and we managed to raise the kids together. And I would take people sailing. That was my job. I was working for a women's sailing school, and then I started leading trips myself in different countries around the world. I take people for a week at a time out to just have experience a little bit of what it was like to be on a boat and having a sailing vacation, something you guys all know about. But this was for people who didn't do that much. This is under the temple of Poseidon in Greece. And when Nicholas was in junior in high school and Sam was in 8th grade, I realized that the boys were they didn't know anything about how we put food on the table. Olivier was a delivery skipper too, and I was off sailing, and the boys were just always home in Vermont. So I bought a boat in St. Martin. I found a boat, and with them we took joint custody to sea for one school year. I sailed with them from St. Martin to Tahiti, and then Olivier took over and sailed with them from Tahiti to New Caledonia. So they had a whole school year at sea, which changed their lives. Both boys ended up, Nicholas was the oldest one. He came back into high school as a senior and knew that he wanted to be resourceful and be able to fix things and know how things work, like all the people he'd met on boats. So the solution for that was Maine Maritime, and both boys ended up there, and both boys have marine systems engineering degrees, and they work on the big ships that used to terrorize me. Nicholas is off at sea right now, and he's the father. This is the one who's the father of the 2 grandchildren. And Sam is the younger one, but they both live within 20 minutes of me. And that's it. That's the story. I know I'm going to think of other things that I could have tried to fit in here, but I've gone over as usual because it's a big story to fit into, not a lot of time. This was the boat in Sri Lanka, in Tahiti with the boys.
What
And
a
that's
wonderful talk, Tania. I absolutely loved it.
Thank you. I'm sorry I talk so fast. It's just I need to fit everything in.
Oh God, I could go on for another 3 hours. You fantastic description of what happened to you out there, and the excitement and the terror and it brings it back from what I read in Cruising World so many years ago, and just I love your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them too.
One
I don't
question
hear
I had was on your
granddaughters, okay?
you turned on your EPIRB. You never said, did anybody ever respond to it, or what happened?
No, that ship that I saw kept on going. It
And
didn't respond.
nobody ever found that called you or anything like that?
No, I turned it off.
Oh,
I
okay.
activated and then I turned it off or took the battery out or whatever. I don't remember how I turned it off, but when I realized I wasn't sinking, I was like, all right, nobody came anyway, so just turn it off. Fat lot of good one of those things did.
Would you have gone in a different direction now? Like, would you have gone easterly
No,
for your
I would have done the same thing. That was the right route. That was the milk run. That's what it's a pretty traditional route. And being alone, I liked knowing that I was going to see other boats wherever I went, other cruisers. So that was the route that would take me to anchorages where other boats would be. Back then, of course, there were many fewer boats than there are now. So that mattered more.
Thanks.
Thank you. That's it. Usually somebody asks what kind of engine I had.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What's the most interesting question you got asked when you reached New York?
What was the most interesting question I got asked? Oh gosh, I don't know. I've been asked a lot of questions by kids, by older people. I guess people always wanted to know if I would do it again. And I don't think I would be able to ever do it again the first time like I did, and I obviously haven't done it again. I've thought about doing different trips, but life, the thing that my dad gave me was this opportunity at a time before you get anchored by all the responsibilities of life and kids. And now I'm not going to leave my grandkids now either. I love being with my kids. I love being with my grandkids now. I'm happy doing the short trips. I don't need to go away for any long spell again.
So what was your engine?
Oh, it was a Buick, Bukh. And they were good engines back then. I don't think the Buick exists anymore. I think it was bought out by somebody else. I don't remember, but they were good engines. I just had a lemon. And it was also not really the perfect design for the boat. Things like when I needed to get to the starter, I had to take the engine out of the boat. There were just things that were really inaccessible and hard to maintain that needed to be maintained. I know that and I can tell you what happened to Veruna. Do you want to know what happened to her?
Yeah.
Tell you that story. So she was the next owner was this banker in Atlantic City who wanted to sail around the world, and he fixed her up, and when he finally retired, he left. He got within a couple 100 miles of the Virgin Islands and decided he didn't want to be away from his grandchildren, and it wasn't fun on a little boat. So he brought it back and he sold it to a guy from Detroit who also thought he was going to sail around the world. But then the real estate market in Detroit tanked and he couldn't sell his house. So in the intervening time, trying to sell his house, he met a woman. He had a grandchild. He didn't want to leave that grandchild, and he didn't want to leave the woman. So he sold the boat to a guy in Maine who was able to keep it right. He had a house right on the water, and he had a rail. He could lift her up in and up out of the water with the tides, which was very cool. And I actually finally met him 2 weeks after he sold her because he had Parkinson's. He had to sell her. And he did a trip with her, and he put in a new I think he switched out the engine for a Yanmar, and got her down to the Bahamas and back. So he actually traveled with her and then sold her to this Greek guy down in Florida who trailered her down and outfitted her with radar and gosh, what else did he have on it? He put all these electronics on it, and he was in touch with me, and I'm like, those things aren't going to work. That boat's too wet. You can't have all that stuff. But anyway, he put all that stuff on it and decided he was going to sail back to Greece with it after he retired. And so people were telling me about what he was doing on Facebook. I don't have Facebook, but friends do, and they would other people would tell me what was going on. And he got to Bermuda, and of course things got wet and he had to do a bunch of repairs. He got to the Azores, things were wet and he had to do a bunch of repairs. And then about 300 miles west of Gibraltar, things got wet and broke, and he didn't want to head into the Mediterranean. He abandoned her and he got on a ship and left her. So this was about 4 or 5 years ago. So he didn't say he had scuttled her. I don't know. So I can fantasize about her being found by a Moroccan fisherman and having another life somewhere. But yeah, that was a little death too, to find that out.
Now, what would you do on cloudy days when you have cloudy days? Do you used to keep logs of dead reckoning, or you just wait until you see the sky?
I did do a lot of dead reckoning, but even unless it was a full-on storm, in which case I was completely dead reckoning, the sun would always kind of come through the clouds at some point. And just as long as I had a little bit of sun, I could do it. Got pretty good at it. You can switch out the filters on the sextant so that as soon as you see even the littlest bit of sun, you can get a sight. So almost always the sun was available I mean, I had to like keep an eye out and not, not let my guard down, just keep watching for it. That was, like I said, it was the suspense of every day was where am I? Where am I going to find myself today?
Did
And
you
that
do
was,
all noon shots, or do you have a good enough clock to be able to do other?
I did sun and stars. The moon never worked out that well for me. The moon is a little bit is a little difficult because of the reflection. You don't get a really good horizon with the moonlight on the horizon. It was always a little trickier. The stars were more but then, you need to have a clear sky for that too. It was mostly the sun, and the stars was just for playing and trying it out.
Mhm. So, but your real navigation was the high noon shots, I take it?
I did a morning shot as soon as
Oh.
the sun was about 30 degrees up over the horizon, and then the
Okay.
noon shot, and those two. And then sometimes I do an afternoon one too, and just bring the LOP across.
Okay.
But no, it was almost always by noon I knew where I was, because I'd calculate exactly as close to noon as possible so that I'd get a really good cross with the morning's LOP. And then I'd know where I was. I knew I'd got a pretty good fix.
Okay.
So every day at noon I could plot on the chart how far I'd gone and see what my course was and count the miles to how much would be left at that speed.
What made you opt for a full keel boat?
Contessa 26 has a really great reputation. She's a solid boat. I mean, for a little boat like that and full keel of it was only 4-foot draft for the 26-foot boat. So it wasn't like I had a deep keel, literally. It just felt a lot more stable and, integrally whole to have a nice full keel. And she was fast still. She was a very fast boat. Contessa 26 has a little cult following. They're great little boats. People have done a lot of voyages on them across oceans, around the world. Other people have done it too. And the 32 is also a pretty sweet boat.
All right, well, if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank you for your time. It was, I'll speak for everybody here in the room. It was delightful, entertaining, educational, and something that I know I've got my 12-year-old daughter in the room. Maybe I'll be able to give her something similar in the future.
Maybe.
Well,
it's worth it.
Thank you very much, Tanya. I love that talk.